When fans learned about KOF 15 standardizing the input command for all characters' climax supers, they weren't all enthusiastic about it. It is true that in past games, one of the aspects that could make a character unique and memorable is a tough as nail, hard to execute super that, once it's perfectly done, rewards you with the most delicious feeling of accomplishment. That can't be said for all of them though. While some of these supers can be really powerful, or at the very least look pretty cool, others on the other hand seem to be overly complicated just for the sake of breaking your controller or bursting one of your veins out of frustration. And as someone who had to go through many of hypertension-inducing motion inputs, I think that having the same input for all climaxes isn't that bad of an idea. At first, this video was meant to be a regular top 10 list, but the more I researched, the more questionable supers with abominable inputs I discovered, not including the ones that traumatized me personally in the past and refused to be forgotten. There are just too many that I felt bad leaving behind so many nightmare supers, so I decided to make it a top 20 list instead, with a substantial honorable mention section for those that didn't make the cut. And even with all that, I'm confident that there are many others that aren't present, which I'm sure you won't fail to mention in the comments. Without further ado, here's the top 20 hardest supers to execute in KOF. As a new character of the version of KOF 2002, Shanfei is a very fun character to play. Her short-ranged fireballs are quite strong. She has a fast overhead, a decent DP, and a respectable number of supers. The best among them, in my opinion, is Zhe Prime, the number 20 of this list, but it can be tricky to learn its execution though. To activate it, you only need to press the A and C buttons simultaneously with no motion input requirements, but that's only the first step. After that, you need to execute two other motion inputs as quickly as possible if you want all the attacks of the super to combo. If you correctly landed the super, it will cause your opponent to wall bounce and gives you the opportunity to follow it with different attacks, including other supers. But even if the super gets blocked, it still causes a gut crush to your enemy. I wouldn't say Zhe Prime is hard, but it's certainly very unique and demands a little bit of time to get it consistently right. This is easily one of Shanfei's strongest assets. ShoryuGame had many supers throughout the series. One of them stands out for being quite unique though, as it serves as a follow-up move that can only be executed at the very end of its classic super, Maiden Masher. The super in question is Wolf Bloom. To pull this bad boy out, you need to perform 4 quarter circles forward plus AC. The challenge is not to enter this command quickly, as you have enough time to do it during the Maiden Masher. The real challenge is to time it so that you press the AC buttons just as Yori finishes his attack. Or you can do it my way, aka the lazy noob way, and just keep rotating that stick as many times as you can, then press those buttons when the time comes. Wolf Bloom is not a very damaging super, but if it guarantees that it will KO the opponent, then there is no reason for you to hold back from doing it. I think it's still worth it just to hear that mad laughter from Iori. It comes with no surprise that one of the hardest characters to play in KOF, good girl Ngel, has also the most unorthodox supers in the franchise. Her Blue Monday parade and loyalty test for liberalists are weird enough execution-wise, but the one that takes the cake is her hidden desperate move, Survivor's Banquet, also known among her fans as the People's Elbow. Now, to be honest, the command itself, albeit not the most common combination, is not difficult. You need to push down 3 times plus the CD buttons. However, the super will only work against already knocked down enemies, and since people get on their feet pretty quickly in these games, you have a very strict, short window of time to execute it, hence its difficulty. When it's perfectly done, you'll get to see Ngel make a cool reference to The Rock's famous wrestling move. In recent games, this super is still kinda there, but instead of being its own thing, it had become part of her other counter super. Benimaru is a mainstay in the KOF series, and he is not necessarily known for being a difficult character to play. Yet, for some twisted reason, they gave his hidden desperate move one of the most awkward motion inputs in 2002, both vanilla and UM. Many characters had strange inputs for their supers in 2002 vanilla, but they got simplified in UM. Benimaru is not one of them. At first, I thought we were dealing with some kind of relative to the Prizel input until I realized that there is an easier way to execute it. I just did a forward half circle forward motion, just like a Ao Shokoken for example, and back forward. It's still a bit complicated, but it's a lot more manageable if you look at it this way. Depending on what button you pressed, an electric orb will be created somewhere around Benny's body, acting as a shield and a mean to pressure the opponent, though creating the orb on his foot is the best option in my opinion. This place goes to multiple supers belonging to 3 different characters, Nameless's Shakuho and Zetsue, K49's The Moon and you get lost too, yes that's a super's name, and Geese's Raging Storm. You guessed it, the one thing in common between these supers is their input command, the infamous Prizel input. There might be other supers using this input, but only these ones come to my mind now. I don't know how or why they came up with such a convoluted motion. It's super awkward. The way I learned to do it is to charge down backward for a bit before I continue with the rest of the input. I know it's not mandatory to charge it at first, but I realized that it somehow makes things easier, and I managed to pull it out more frequently this way. The input requires you to be fast and consistent, as many of the supers with the Prizel input act as anti-air moves, meaning there is no room for mistakes. The fact that this is so low in the list means that the best is yet to come. Brace yourselves everyone. Let's stay with K49 for a while, with one of the weirdest supers in probably all fighting games. The weirdness comes from its name, the way it looks, and the input to execute it. To perform K49's hidden desperate move in Vanilla 2002, you need to be in the air and push back then forward 4 times. No additional button press is needed to confirm it. Because of how gravity works, I never managed to pull this super out as it was intended. K49 always touches the ground before I could push all the buttons. There is an easier way to do it though, inconsistent but doable. Just spam back and forward while on the ground and watch K49 performing this silly dance. At some point he will backdash and the game considers that as being airborne. With little luck, the input will be registered and the super executed. I'm not sure how effective that would be against a human opponent though. And now, with the first type of supers that I like to call QTs, short for Quick Time Events on steroids. Like Quick Time Events in action games, you have to push specific buttons during a short period of time. The twist with KOF is that the timing is a lot tighter, and you have no button prompt on the screen telling you what button to push. You have to memorize the whole sequence, and it's often pretty lengthy, so get that memory of yours to work. Richard Meyer, who made an appearance in KOF Maximum Impact 2, uses this kind of input in his level 3 super Wild Dance. What makes his super even harder is the fact that you need to enter entire motions and not just simple buttons. Thankfully, the Maximum Impact series is pretty forgiving when it comes to registering motion inputs, making Wild Dance one of the easiest supers in this category. Otherwise, it would be a lot higher on the list. How about we take a dive through time and go back to simpler but aggravating times with KOF 94. Even though what I'm about to say is true for most supers in this title, I think that Kinsu's is a good representative of the total BS we had to deal with. What makes Shinryu Tenbukyaku hard, other than pronouncing its name, is KOF 94. Pretty much everything is hard to do in that game, the supers being the worst. Some are more manageable than others of course, but the harder ones are going to make you pull your hair out of frustration. For instance, the motion in this super, although not very common, doesn't look that complicated, yet for some sick arbitrary reason it just refuses to register. I did manage to pull it out sometimes, but I'll be damned if I know what I did differently from the times where I failed. It's so random. The best part is, it's far from being the hardest to execute in 94. Don't you just love it when the developers decide to give a character an air super that is also a throw super with an input motion that looks like this? That's Vice's overkill. Just how am I supposed to have the speed, reflexes, and skill to execute this abomination of input efficiently? A simple air throw requires a good deal of reflexes, let alone this thing. To capture footage for overkill, I just kept jumping like an idiot, hoping that the opponent jumps towards me and having enough time to execute the super, which is easier said than done obviously. I either kept missing the input execution or getting it right when the opponent was far from me. I just can't see how overkill can be done how it was meant to be in 2002 UN. Thankfully, in recent games, the super fits better in Vice's move list. It can be done after cancelling her plunging attack splash. The execution is still hard though. Going back to Maximum Impact 2, Louise Merring, the well-meaning alien who serves as the sub-boss of the game, has an unnecessary, complicated, and infuriating super to execute. Minuet of Damnation, I'm not even sure if that's how it's pronounced, is a throw super that requires you to be close to the opponent. The problem is that the input looks like this. You can see it, right? That ugly arrow pointing up. Whenever you see an input command with an upward arrow, you know a rough time is awaiting you. Your character is always gonna jump before you push the final button to confirm, making the execution of the super impossible. The only times I can think of where this kind of supers are doable are when you are already knocked down. Entering the command before you stand up can prevent your character from jumping, or you can jump on your own beforehand, performing the input while you are airborne and hit the confirm button just as you land. However, the Maximum Impact series are 3D games and the jumps there are very limited. Thankfully, Louise has an air dash allowing her to stay in the air a bit longer, and because I needed to stay close to the opponent, I had to do those air dashes around them. Alright, this is not gonna work outside the training mode. Remember when I told you that we are not done with KOF 94 supers? Well, here's what I meant. Athena's desperation move, Shining Crystal Bit, is notorious for being one of the hardest things to do in all classic fighting games. And for those who had discovered the series recently and don't understand what I'm talking about because Athena's super is just a double half circus backward, I envy you. This is how Shining Crystal Bit used to look in its infancy. Just look at this chaos. Why the input ends with an upward back arrow? This is plain evil from the developers. It's as if you're telling Athena to stay away and go home. And you don't want her to stay away. She needs to be close to the opponent for her super to hit. It just defeats its whole purpose. Cherry on the cake, you need to confirm with 2 buttons. And let me remind you, this is a retro game. The timing is super tight. If you push one button a fraction of a second before or after the other, the command won't register. And of course, you can't map those 2 buttons to a single one like in recent games. In KOF 95, this super exists with the same inputs, but I find it much more doable there. The timing and the input registration are far more forgiving, but in 94, it's a true nightmare. Is there a way to make an input command more aggravating and exasperating than the one we made for Athena Super? Is probably the question the developers ask themselves before coming up with the motion input for Hidden Super, Final Bringer. They probably were like, oh, you figured out a way to execute her super by jumping beforehand so we can avoid that she jumps at the end of the execution. Let us ruin that for you. And so they made the first input in Hidden Super a charge motion, and the last input an upward arrow, because of course they did. I'm sure that they already knew that most players aren't gonna be able to do those supers. That's why in the Arashi collection, they had the generosity to include a demo option that lets you watch how the special moves and supers look like. How kind of them. You'd be sorely mistaken if you think that Raging Storm and its Brittle input is the hardest thing they include in Geese's move list. Let me introduce Deadly Rave, another recurring super of the Southtown boss, not as famous as a Raging Storm, but far more complicated to do. And yes, it is one of the aforementioned cuties. From now on we're gonna see a lot of those. Starting with a command throw-like motion, you need to activate the super with the B, C and D buttons together, and then the real fun begins. You'll have to push A twice, B twice, C twice and D twice. Then, assuming you got the timing right, you need to do a quarter circle backward plus CD to perform the final blow of the super. What makes Deadly Rave harder than Richard's Wild Dance is the incredibly precise timing required during those button pressing, and trust me, it's a very easy thing to mess up. What can be harder than a super that's called Deadly Rave? Peach combo Doremi, of course, and it's just as cutesy as it sounds. Actually, it's not cute at all. This is how it looks. To be fair, you don't need to press all those buttons. Far from it. Peach combo Doremi has 7 variations, but you only need to execute one of them. Of course, Momoko, the owner of this desperation move, will perform different attacks depending on the buttons that were pressed. I did go through all the variations for the sake of capturing footage, but if you want my advice, just pick one with an easy to remember combination for you. What makes this super harder than Geese's is KOF 11. There is a 5th button in that game that is integrated in the super and makes things a little bit more complicated. That and the order of the button pressing that is not as obvious as Geese's Deadly Rave. It's pretty ironic that one of the nicest and cutest characters in KOF has some of the toughest and cruelest supers in the series. After her Shining Crystal bit was updated with a much more manageable execution input in '96, Athena comes back in 2002 with a hidden desperate move that will put your memory, skill and sense of rhythm into a harsh test. After a simple quarter circle backward plus all 4 buttons comes a sequence of button pressing with a strict timing and order. Make a simple mistake and Athena falls on her butt in a clear tell that the super failed, and then you better brace yourself for the punish. However, if you get everything right, including the last finishing move with quarter circle forward, then you'll get to see a pretty cool display of Athena's every costume from 2002 all the way back to '94. Then she goes even beyond that, becoming Princess Athena, Schoolgirl Athena, Bikini Athena, and whatever that is Athena. There are 2 options to end the super. One prioritizes healing Athena, while the other goes for an explosive finisher. Just for its show, I think this super is actually worth the trouble learning it. Making just one appearance in the KOF series, the king didn't forget to bring his weird moves and supers with him. His break spiral has the same awkward motion input that it had in Fatal Fury, but I found it easier to do in 11, especially after a roll or a jump, even with the arrow pointing up forward. That's why this place actually goes to his other super, Beat Rush. Admittedly, this super looks just like Athena's in the previous entry, with some small differences. Beat Rush starts with a half circle backward forward motion, requires 8 button pressing instead of 7, meaning one potential occasion to screw things up, and finally, it ends with a DP motion. A DP is technically more complicated than a quarter circle. Taking all that into account, that makes Beat Rush harder than Psycho Medley, but I still think Athena's super looks better. Remember Richard Mayer and his Wild Dance? What if we took that super and integrated it in a game with a lot less forgiving timing? That's the closest thing we can use to describe Clark's hidden desperate move in 2002 UM, Roaring Sphere. Unlike Athena and Duck's supers, with Clark we have to perform entire motions instead of just button pressing in a specific order and precise timing. After the initial double half circles forward plus BD, you'll need to execute ADP plus D just as Clark reaches his opponent. After that, it's gonna be a chain of half circle punch, half circle kick, double down kick, and finally double down plus all 4 buttons. Needless to specify that you need to be quick and you need to be precise. If you are familiar with Clark's moveset, then that would definitely ease things up for you, as those motions are his special moves, something that helped me out personally when I noticed it. You thought we're done with Geese Howard? Wrong. His nightmare version has still some unpleasant surprises for our arcade sticks. Raging Storm, not to confuse with Raging Storm, is his other level 2 desperation move, and by far the most convoluted super in his move list. No input command for any other super looks like it, and it doesn't fit in any category. Starting with a forward half circle forward plus BD, you need to press down plus C. After that, you press C again, and then you perform a last motion with a quarter circle backward forward plus CD. This seemingly random combination of motions, directional buttons, and simple button pressing makes the input so hard to remember and extremely easy to drop. But I guess it just fit in for the alternative version of Geese to have such a nightmarish super to execute. In all honesty, I think this entry is the worst of the worst in the QT's category, and until the very end of the making of this video, I was convinced that this is the hardest and most annoying and frustrating super in KOF. This honor goes to Gaitendo's Rush. So what makes Rush more aggravating than the likes of Deadly Rave, Psycho Medley or Roaring Sphere? Three things in fact. The first is the rhythm in which the buttons must be pressed. Unlike the aforementioned supers, Guy hits his opponent in different rhythms. For instance, the two jabs at the beginning come out pretty fast. After that, his attacks get slower. This change in tempo will mess up your button pressing rhythm more often than you think. The second thing that makes this super harder is the fact that you need to press directional buttons. Yep, it's those ups, downs, rights and lefts, and even diagonals, because why the heck not? I don't know if it's just me, but I find it a lot harder to remember the correct order of the directional buttons than the regular ones. This is the only super where I actually had to take a picture of the input and use it to execute the super. I just couldn't remember the order. And finally, you may have already guessed it, if you perform this super from the player 2 side, then the inputs become inverted. Of course they do, but not all of them, mind you. Ups and downs are still ups and downs in both sides, obviously, but the diagonal one becomes the other diagonal. You can see why this becomes unbearably confusing. Seriously, F this super. Before unveiling what could possibly top Gaitendo's Rush, here's some honorable mentions. Arashi Yashiro's Armageddon in Vanilla 2002 is pretty unorthodox to execute. It's true that you won't need to use your stick or D-pad, but if there is some latency in your button pressing, or if you can't map several buttons to a single one, you may struggle with this super. Still in the same game, Whip and Maxima have similar input commands for their supers. They're not very hard per se, but they demand a bit of time to get used to. Krauser Gigantic Cyclone in 98 requires a third half circle backward to execute. It may not sound that bad, but that extra motion makes the super a lot harder to do than one may think. The input for K-Dash's Crimson Star Road looks simple enough, but if you don't know how much time you need to wait before you push that last button, you're gonna struggle. Once you figure out the right timing, it's pretty easy. Some supers necessitate that you press a sequence of buttons very fast without using the stick. The timing can be tricky, and some of these supers, like Dulon's, requires you to be close to your opponent to activate, which they forgot to tell you in the move list. Diamond has a 3-step super where you have to execute extra motion inputs in a very specific timing, otherwise you won't see the super at its full potential. Finally, Rafts in 02 doesn't require much input-wise, but the frame-perfect timing that the Galactica Phantom at the end requires makes the super insanely difficult to land, but so much enjoyable if you succeed. I have something to confess to you. Before starting making this video, I didn't even know this super existed. When I asked you in that post what super is the hardest to execute for you, it's when I learned of its existence. And at first, I thought it was a troll. I mean, Ryo Sakazaki has a hard super? I know Ryo's moveset, and none of his supers is hard, or so I thought. but then I saw more of you people mentioning it, so I wanted to know what it looked like, and this is what I got. I was like, what the heck, that's just Ryuko Rambo Rage. He's hidden the M too. That's not hard to do at all. Only then I noticed that Ryu has actually two hidden disparate moves that seemingly look the same but have different inputs. Ryuko Rambo Destroy has a deceptively easier input command. I mean, it's just a quarter circle forward plus C and then you press A. How hard can this be? Well, if you try doing the super as it's told in the move list, you'll just keep spamming fireballs all day long. I was confused. I was wondering maybe it's an air super, maybe it's a counter super, maybe it acts as a follow-up. None of that is right. This is the only super where I had to look it up to know what the heck am I supposed to do. It turns out, this super can only be done if you cancel it from another move. Of course, they never mentioned that in the move list. But even knowing that, I spent a ridiculous amount of time trying this method and finally succeeded in doing it once after I cancelled it from a max mode activation. I tried doing it again later, but just couldn't. The question that you are probably asking yourself now is, why even bother? Just execute the Rage variation with a straightforward motion input. It's true that Rage and Destroy look exactly the same and probably deal the same amount of damage. There is one crucial difference between the two. Ryuko Rambo Destroy is unblockable, and because it looks the same as Rage, you can see why this is a huge advantage, as you can easily trick your opponent with it. Because it's so mysterious and sneaky, and because its input looks simple at first but is actually incredibly hard to do, Ryuko Rambo Destroy wins the title of the hardest super to execute in KOF. So, which one of these supers haunts your nightmares? Or is there others that I didn't mention in the list? Share your answer with us in the comments. Special thanks to my generous patrons for their support. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, and why not consider subscribing to the channel. Thanks for watching.